Peaches had been lying in that hospital room for so long that time itself seemed to lose its shape, shrinking down into a string of days worn away by the smell of antiseptic, the pale white glare of the lights, and the steady beeping of the monitors ticking on like a merciless clock. Her frail body was trapped among tubes and needles, but her mind was painfully clear. She could feel, with terrifying sharpness, what no doctor dared to say outright and what her loved ones still tried to deny. Even though the oxygen still flowed and the doctors still fought for every breath, the final boundary of her life had already begun to blur beneath her feet. Every time Peach's eyelids grew heavy, she was not only fighting exhaustion, but also the fear that if she let them close for too long, there would be no next time she opened them. In that limbo between life and death, what weighed on her chest was no longer illness, but the burden of a truth she had hidden for many years, a secret she once believed she could carry into the grave, as if it were just another part of herself. Leslie appeared in that room like a shadow that refused to let go. She paced back and forth, leaned against the wall, sat down only to spring up again, her eyes red from lack of sleep and strain, but the stubborn fire in her gaze still refusing to die. She clung to treatment plans, to half-hearted reassurances, to anything that looked like a shred of hope. She demanded more consultations, called in more specialists, questioned nurses, and searched for every possible option as if sheer determination alone could make death back down. In truth, it was not only the fear of losing the woman who had practically raised her, but also the fear of emptiness, the terror that when Peaches was gone, the last pieces tying Leslie to any notion of family would shatter completely. Family had never been a refuge for her. It was more like an old wound that never stopped bleeding. But Peaches was the only one who had ever tried to bandage it. Now, the thought of losing the one person who had embraced her amid the wreckage was unbearable. So Leslie stayed rooted in that room, like someone clinging to the edge of a cliff, unwilling to let anything slip from her grasp one more time. While Leslie wrestled with the present, Peaches was drowning in the whirlpool of memory and regret. On long nights, when the pain in her chest rose like cold waves, she drifted through images of Barbara, the children from years ago, and all the times she had chosen silence instead of facing the truth. Barbara had once stood before her with the blazing eyes of a mother backed into a corner, vowing to protect her daughters at any cost, even if it meant sacrificing her own life. But Barbara's death had swept everything into a different storm, darker and more twisted, where fear, jealousy, guilt, and the instinct to survive blended into one another. Peaches had watched Leslie grow up without the warmth of true family love, had seen her flounder through mistakes and wounds, and convinced herself that keeping the secret might be the less cruel choice. At the same time, she quietly followed Shanice, the second child in that old photograph, as she grew up into a life entirely different, stepping into adulthood with invisible scars no one understood the source of. Every time the two young women appeared in the same room, Peaches could feel an invisible thread pulling them together, only to be blocked by walls that she herself had helped build. She had chosen silence because she thought she was protecting them both, but as the years passed, that silence felt more and more like a long, drawn-out betrayal. In these final days, the haunting shadow of Barbara's legacy returned like a ghost. Peaches did not only remember her old friend, but also the papers, sealed envelopes, and lawyer meetings she had witnessed but never dared to speak of. She knew more than anyone suspected, not only about who was a biological child and who was an heir on paper, but also about the times Barbara had doubted, had wanted to change her will, had written and torn things up, had hidden copies in places only a very few might know about. On some nights, lying in that hospital bed, Peaches wondered whether those documents still existed, or if someone had quietly gotten rid of them, whether someone else was already profiting from her prolonged silence. Because Peaches was not the only one who knew that both children in the photograph shared Barbara's blood. Those questions made her realize that if she died with this secret, she would not only be betraying Barbara, but also handing other people the power to twist the truth however they pleased, to wield it like a weapon in future power struggles. To her, that was even more frightening than death itself. That morning, as the first light of day slipped through the thin curtain and cast cold streaks across the floor, Peaches could clearly feel that her body was closing in on its final distance. Each breath cost more effort, but her mind was strangely sharp. She knew this was her last chance to change the trajectory of the lives she had bound together with a single secret. A nurse came in, carrying the familiar look of someone who had witnessed hundreds of endings, and Peaches used what little strength she had left to ask for Leslie. There was no time for circling around the truth anymore, no room for soothing words. The nearness of death no longer felt like fear, but like a command pushing her to speak before the machines became nothing more than a meaningless backdrop to a body that could no longer say anything at all. Leslie entered with the urgency of someone trying to save what cannot be saved, her hand gripping Peaches as if she could drag her back from the edge by sheer force. But inside Leslie, another battle was raging. Part of her was still the panicked child, terrified of being abandoned, while another part was the woman who had grown too familiar with disappointment, who always suspected everything and everyone, even last-minute displays of tenderness. When Peaches' trembling hand slipped under the pillow, Leslie flinched. That small movement made her stomach knot up. She had lived too long in a world where every gesture could signal some hidden agenda. Was Peaches reaching for medication? A will? Some piece of paper that could change the entire game of Barbara's estate? Or just some harmless keepsake? Leslie no longer had the ability to see anything through innocent eyes, not even in this moment. When the old photograph was pulled from its hiding place, its edges curled with age and its colors almost faded into one another. Leslie still had no idea her life was about to be broken one more time. She picked up the picture with guarded hands, as if it were evidence in a trial rather than a fragment of memory. The name Barbara made her chest tighten instantly. The image of the woman holding two small children left Leslie stunned. She recognized herself in an instant. The face, the eyes, the way the little body was tucked into that embrace. But then her gaze slid to the other child. It was not an unfamiliar face. It was a small replica of a face she had seen countless times in the present, a face that had become a thorn in her side over the past months. The second child carried the features of Shanice, of Shani in the present day, the woman Leslie had seen as a threat, a shadow slipping into every space between her and Ted. The realization of that resemblance hit her like a blow, as if the entire hospital room had suddenly tipped sideways. Everything Peaches said afterwards did not sound to Leslie like confession, but like a series of sharp strikes against each layer of defense she had built around herself. When the truth surfaced that Shanice was Barbara's second daughter, that the two girls in the photo were biological sisters, that the woman Leslie had confronted, suspected, and resented actually shared the very thing she believed she had lost forever, Leslie felt as if she'd been yanked out of the mirror of her old life and thrown into another reality. In that previous reality, Shanice was just a coworker who was too close to Ted, a name Leslie felt came up far too often in calls, messages, and late meetings. Every time she saw them standing too near each other, laughing too freely, Leslie swallowed down a slow-burning anger and told herself she was overreacting, that her fears were only shadows cast by betrayals from her past. But part of her always believed there was something unspoken between Shanice and Ted, something beyond professional boundaries. Now, knowing that woman might be her sister, all those old thoughts twisted into a tangled, dirty, shameful mess. Leslie suddenly felt both betrayed and like the betrayer of her own flesh and blood, without ever knowing it. The turmoil inside Leslie was far more than simply accepting a new blood tie. It was an all-out war between accumulated wounds and a faint chance at healing. She could not easily believe that these deathbed revelations were pure and uncomplicated. Peaches was dying, Peaches was regretful, Peaches wanted to atone. All of that was true, but Leslie could not forget that this same woman had stayed silent for decades. Silent while she grew up in pain, silent while she struggled to carve out her place, silent while she went head-to-head with Shanice without any access to the truth. Memories of tense confrontations with Shanice, of the times they faced each other in meetings with accusations simmering in every glance, came back like stinging slaps. Leslie was backed into an emotional corner where she had to ask herself, could she really trust that Peaches wasn't just rearranging the truth at the last minute to ease her own conscience? Or had someone pressured her, persuaded her that revealing the secret now would shift the balance of power and affect Barbara's will and estate in someone else's favor? In that suffocating hospital room, another battle was quietly stirring at the same time. The one over Barbara's legacy. Leslie could not stop thinking about the paperwork. The wills, the trust funds, the drawn-out disputes, the strange names that had appeared on documents, the asset distributions that had never been entirely clear. If Shanice really was Barbara's daughter, it meant everything could be reconsidered. Leslie's place in the picture of the estate, the rights she had taken for granted, the decisions she had made based on the belief that she was the only one, could all be shaken in an instant. While her heart ached at the thought of suddenly having a sister, her mind was coldly calculating the legal consequences. She wondered if Peaches was hiding more than just a photograph, perhaps an old will, forgotten addenda, letters from Barbara, proof that no lawyer had ever seen. She wondered if someone else was standing in the background, urging Peaches to speak up in order to blow up the current power structure and knock Leslie from the position she had just managed to solidify after so many years of struggle. In those final minutes, when Peaches' breathing grew thinner and the room so quiet that the sound of the monitor seemed to pierce straight into her skull, Leslie realized that whether she accepted it or not, this secret had already been thrown into her life like a grenade with the pin pulled. She clutched the photograph to her chest, not just as a memento, but as a verdict that forced her to choose. If she told Shanice the truth right away, she would have to confront the shame of all the suspicions, the words, and the actions she had directed at her. She would have to face Ted seeing them both differently and answer for the murky line between marital jealousy and the boundaries of a brother-in-law and sister-in-law. If she kept silent and buried the secret, she would preserve her current place, avoid the emotional storm that admitting the truth would bring, but it would mean repeating Peach's exact mistake, continuing the cycle of silence and betrayal. And if she chose to verify things in secret, to seek DNA tests, to dig through records and blow the dust off Barbara's wills, she would be stepping into a quiet war not only with Shanice, but with anyone who stood to gain from this ambiguity, from lawyers to other relatives waiting for a chance to carve up the estate. When Peaches finally slipped past the line between being alive and no longer present, Leslie felt a cold emptiness open inside her. There was no one left to ask, no one left to confront, no one left to blame. The burden of the secret had been handed entirely to her, with no instructions attached. Every argument she'd had with Shanice, every icy look they'd exchanged in the hallway, every time Leslie had turned away from a conversation because she couldn't bear the thought that Shanice might be encroaching on what was hers. All of it suddenly became a web of cracks across a wall that was supposed to protect, not divide. She began to see the cruel irony of fate. The person she had always viewed as a threat was now the only one who could reconnect her to a part of her life she thought was lost forever. But to even approach that possibility, she would have to walk through the ashes of her wounded pride, her jealousy, and her anger at having been deceived, not just once, but her entire life. Now, as she left the hospital with the photograph hidden carefully in her bag, Leslie carried not only the grief of losing Peaches, but also a ticking time bomb that would reshape the future of everyone tied to Barbara's legacy. Shanice still knew nothing, still lived in the old reality, in the role she believed was hers, unaware that every step she took rested on thin ice laid down by lies from all sides. Ted still saw everything through the lens of a man trapped between two women, without realizing that what Leslie had once feared as emotional infidelity could be twisted into something even more shocking if the blood tie was revealed at the wrong moment. The others, Danny, Nicole, Madison, Vernon, were still dealing with their own chaos, but all of them were orbiting around Barbara's name like planets around a dead star. Any change in the story of Barbara, her daughters, or the wills hidden away could drag them into a new cycle of struggle. The biggest question now was not simply whether Leslie would acknowledge Shanice as her sister, but how she would use this truth in the silent war that lay ahead. She could turn it into a chance to heal, to admit her mistakes, to build a new kind of family front grounded in truth instead of lies. But with that same truth, she could also choose to turn it into a weapon, to bargain with it, to control Shanice, to leverage it against others in the inheritance battle. Her anger had not cooled, her wounds were still bleeding, and all the times she had been sidelined in the past made it hard to choose the high road. As night fell, Leslie understood that whatever path she chose, she would lose some part of herself. And somewhere in that old photograph, Barbara seemed to be staring straight at her, like a reminder that truth always comes with a price, especially when it arrives too late in a world that has grown used to wearing masks and fighting battles that never truly end.